For me, the absolute nightmare would be for the president to go to Moscow on May the 9th for the big Russian Victory Day, and to have an American president sitting there on Red Square as you watch the army of murderers and rapists go marching by, parading with captured Ukrainian equipment, which was provided by the United States, UK, Germany, and others. That I can, I hope that the president will not accept that kind of an invitation. I do imagine, though, that they are anxious to have a real summit where they can announce some big deal has been made.
Good afternoon, good evening. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It's great to see that so many of you have joined us by Zoom today. I'm Klaus Larres. I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm also a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I've run the Krasno Global Event Series since 2012, and we are still going strong. Today, our distinguished guest is General Ben Hodges, who will be familiar to most of us, not least from his many media appearances, but also because he has joined the Krasno Global Event Series 2 times already. Thank you, Ben, for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hey, dear Professor, thank you very much for the privilege of joining you. I'm up in Ithaca, New York at Cornell University for the week, and it's good to connect with my friends in North Carolina.
Thank you very much. And today we are talking about the situation in Ukraine and the recent turmoil in US-Ukrainian relations and indeed in transatlantic relations. Are we seeing a major revision of the global order? Will the war in Ukraine come to an end soon, and on what conditions? Is the transatlantic alliance finished? Will Putin be invited to the United States, or will Trump visit Moscow soon? And what is the view in China? These and many other questions we will address today. It's really good to have General Hodges with us today to shed some light on these very complex developments. Let me briefly introduce Ben Hodges to you. General Ben Hodges is a former commanding general of the US Army Europe, and he now serves on a number of international advisory boards, including the New Strategic Center in Romania, the Warsaw Security Forum in Poland, and the Renew Democracy Initiative based in New York City, as well as he is also involved with the Atlantik Bruecke. He also consults for several companies on Europe, NATO, and the European Union, and he is the co-author of the book Future War and the Defense of Europe, which was published by Oxford University Press. During his long military career, Ben Hodges served several times in Iraq and in a variety of senior joint and army staff positions in Korea, for example, and in the Pentagon. From 2012 to 2014, he served as Commander, NATO Allied Land Command in Izmir, Turkey. And his last military assignment was as Commanding General, United States Army Europe in Wiesbaden, Germany. And he did that from 2014 to 2017. Ben Hodges retired from the US Army in January 2018, and he now lives in Frankfurt, Germany. But as we just heard, today Ben Hodges joins us from New York State. Welcome, General Hodges. It's great to have you here at the Krasno Global Event Series. Let me ask you straight away, is the Ukraine war coming to an end soon, and has Putin won?
I don't think it's going to end soon. I think we're in for a very long, difficult process moving towards a resolution of the conflict. I think we're in phase 1 right now, which is the preparation phase. All these conversations, everything that's happening, whether it was in the White House or in Brussels or in Riyadh, and all the hundreds of other conversations that are happening, these are all really about trying to figure out how to do a ceasefire. And how do you get a force that could deploy into Ukraine that could compel Russia to live up to the ceasefire? Now, it's not being described this way by the White House, but I'm trying to understand what's happening. So that's why I use this phasing, if you will. That's phase 1. Phase 2 will be the implementation of a ceasefire and the deployment of a force capable of deterring Russia from violating the ceasefire, which they surely will do if we're not there to compel them to live up to it. It's going to take several months before this is all put together and can be deployed. And then finally, phase 3, those are the actual negotiations on the end of the conflict. But the Ukrainians, of course, are not going to negotiate, nor should they negotiate to an end if Russia doesn't live up to a ceasefire. So that's why I think we're in for a still a very long process, no matter how badly the president wants to get a deal done.
Were you surprised by the negotiations or the preliminary negotiations between the United States and Russia in Saudi Arabia?
I think that was part of this process. Conversations happening. There were European countries, Ukraine, other people were frustrated that they were not at the table, but there is no table. And I think this is going to be a long process as the different nations and organizations stake out or make it clear what their aims are, including Europe. I liked what Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski said. He said we need to build our own table and then get the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine to our table.
But the Europeans were upset that they had not been invited to the talks between the US and Russia. Also, they accused President Trump of bringing Putin in from isolation for no concessions, for no anything in return. Would you agree with that point of view?
I do. Now, the fact that Europeans were not brought to the table by the Trump administration is a reflection of the fact that President Trump believes that he's the only one that can actually make a deal of some sort with President Putin. He doesn't really care, in my view, too much about what happens to Ukraine in a broad way, and he has no respect for Europe. So that's why he disregarded them. So Foreign Minister Sikorski's, Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski's comment was basically, we have to earn respect. We make our own table. We get ourselves involved in these talks because Europe, of course, is going to live with the consequences of whatever comes out of it. But in your opening question, you also asked, has Putin already won? And I would say no. The only way that Putin actually wins, because the Russians are in big trouble right now, the only way that Putin actually wins is if the White House bails them out.
Tell us about the military situation on the ground. It's less good than we are told by a lot of media sources who seem to say that Putin is on the offensive, the Russians are going to win that conflict.
Yeah, I completely disagree with that. That is a narrative that's out there, but it doesn't match what's actually happening on the ground. Now, of course, if you're a Ukrainian soldier fighting outside of Pokrovsk or up in Kursk or in other places, or if you're a family that lives in an apartment building in Kharkiv that's getting hit by Shahed drones, it's terrible conditions. But if you can step back and think about it, this war has been going on for 11 years. Russia invaded in 2014 with all the advantages. And after 11 years, they still only control 20% of Ukraine, which is that sliver on the eastern end and Crimea. They've had over 800,000 casualties. Not that that matters to the Kremlin, but the fact is they've lost 800,000 soldiers killed and wounded. They have to get ammunition from North Korea, drones from Iran. The Great Black Sea Fleet, with a really cool name, is nowhere to be found. They're not a part of this conflict anymore. The Great Russian Air Force failed its two most important tasks, which are achieve air superiority and interdict lines of communication. They cannot do either one of those. So actually, I see Russia being in big trouble. Now, last year at the Munich Security Conference in February of 2024, that was when the news came out that Navalny had been killed in captivity, and also that the city of Avdiivka had finally been captured by the Russians. And people were walking around, oh my God, Avdiivka has been captured. And I thought, well, where is Avdiivka? And I looked at my map. Avdiivka is about as far east in Ukraine as you can possibly be. It is just a few miles from the Russian border. So it took Russia years to finally capture Avdiivka. And now 1 year later, actually 13 months later, here in March of 2025, they're still trying to capture Pokrovsk, which is only 60 kilometers from Avdiivka, so about 35 miles. So in a year, after 200,000 casualties, they've gained 35 miles. So the notion that somehow Russia is on the move, they're gaining ground, that is absolutely false.
But Ukraine still has a lot of problems. The energy infrastructure has been targeted all the time. Many people have died. Cities are destroyed. The economy is ruined. Without aid from the United States and until now and Europe, Ukraine would not survive as a functionable state. So, Ukraine is in pretty big difficulties as well, isn't it?
Of course they are. But the way you just described the army, that would be George Washington's army for most of the American Revolution, where he had terrible problems with desertion, inadequate supplies. But the thing that they did not lack in our army in the Revolution was the will to win. And we know from history that war is a test of will as much as it is a test of logistics. And it's clear that Ukraine, the soldiers, the government, the people have that will. Now, you are exactly right that there are serious problems with what they're trying to do in the military. They have got to figure out how do they get more women and men into formations that are trained and ready to fight. The burden is on the government to do that, to earn the confidence of families that their son or daughter will not be deployed until they are properly trained and equipped. And there are several hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers in the ranks. But they cannot go on forever without growing the size of the army. So this is something that has to be done. We know that the Ukrainian armed forces have made some changes to their structure to make it more flexible and to take advantage of the capabilities that they have. The defense industry is growing while they're at war, despite the bombing of energy infrastructure. But Ukrainian engineers have figured out how do you build a defense industry in a distributed way that can survive that. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat or make it sound better than it is. I'm just saying if when I look at what's happening on the ground, when I look at the economy of Russia as well as Ukraine, I think the Russians are in big trouble, and that the only way that they win is if the West completely quits on Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are not going to say, okay, well, I guess there's no way we can win and surrender, because there will not be a nice peaceful surrender where they're all allowed to go home. They know what happens when the Red Army shows up at their village. And so I think they're going to fight to the very end with or without us.
But hasn't that just happened that at least half of the West has actually just quit the Ukraine war? We have the end of American military aid to Ukraine. Even intelligence cooperation has been switched off. So Ukraine entirely depends on the Europeans. And the Europeans, as we all know, are not the strongest militarily either.
Well, that doesn't matter. And actually, Europe provides more than half of what has been provided to Ukraine. What is needed is not German army or French army or the British army in Ukraine in terms of aid. What is needed is ammunition and assurance that these kind of capabilities are going to continue. Now, of course, you're right that the Europeans are going to have to provide capability to enforce the ceasefire, and we see that Prime Minister Starmer, President Macron, and others are already beginning to work to figure out what would be required for some sort of a ceasefire enforcement force. But of course, we've got to figure out first what kind of a ceasefire are they going to enforce? What are the conditions? What will be the mission for this force that will be European? This is all the kind of work that's being sorted out, I think, during this so-called preparation phase. Europe's industrial capacity dwarfs Russia. I mean, we know that Russia's economy is about the size of Spain. And so if the Europeans do, in fact, wake up and do what they are capable of doing, then I think you'll see an enormous increase in capabilities that are provided from Europe. And certainly what Dr. von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, announced today, that the EU looks like they may have figured out how to free up 800 billion euro The German Bundestag, the parliament, of course, is working on doing something now in the next 3 weeks before the new government is in place to change the law that would allow Germany to do deficit spending. This is an example of political will finally taking effect that would create at least 200 billion more euro available for growing Germany's defense capabilities. So look, it hadn't happened yet, but I am optimistic. The one area where one of the areas where I'm not optimistic yet is the decision for the United States to cut off intelligence sharing to Ukraine. I don't know how this advances America's interest to cut off intelligence sharing with Ukraine. That makes, if you were cynical or believed in conspiracy, that would cause you to think that clearly the administration has taken sides with Russia and has no interest in helping Ukraine get to a favorable negotiating position. I never in my life did I dream that that would be the case, that the United States would help Russia against a European nation. But based on what we saw Friday in the Oval Office, and then decisions like this to cut off intelligence sharing, I don't know how you draw any other conclusion. The French have indicated that they have some intelligence capabilities that could help make up some of that shortfall. And I think other countries are able to do certain things that they don't advertise. I mean, that's normal that you would not advertise your intelligence capabilities.
How would you explain that intelligence sharing was cut off and that President Trump seems to side with Putin?
Well, of course, I cannot explain it. I can only criticize it, that we would turn our back on a struggling democratic country fighting for its survival and side with an authoritarian regime which breaks international law, does not care about human life, only wants to impose its will on its neighboring countries, which includes the destruction of Ukraine as a state and the destruction of Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine as a state. The Russians have not backed off one bit from their war aims. And so the idea when the president says, Putin told me he wants peace too, that's just not true, unless, of course, he means Putin wants a peace, P-I-E-C-E, of Ukraine, which he already has. So the Russians are not showing any indication that they actually are interested in a peaceful, fair outcome. And I know that the administration knows this, so I don't understand why they continue down this path, other than if you're cynical, it's because they're much more interested in reopening economic relationship with Russia and carving up territories like it was the 18th century.
What is the view in the American military about that? Is there resistance, at least behind the scenes?
I think, of course, I don't know, and we shouldn't know. I mean, the U.S. military, we spend so much time instilling in everybody that we are an apolitical organization, that our oath is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and that our duty is to carry out our mission, protect America's strategic interests, and obey the lawful orders of our civilian authorities. I can only imagine that based on what has happened to the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other senior leaders, that I would imagine there's a lot of introspection going on in senior leadership ranks about what does this mean for our senior leaders now? Will they be asked to do things that are not lawful, as happened in the last Trump administration when the chairman was directed to send soldiers out to shoot protesters in front of the White House. And of course, the chairman, General Milley, refused to do that and said it was unlawful and would not do that.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that, as far as you can guess, I would assume that that policy, which you have just seen, the cutting of aid and intelligence cooperation, will not last forever. Once that minerals deal has been signed by Ukraine and the United States, and perhaps other economic advantages have been obtained by the Trump administration, do you believe that they will then relent again?
I don't know. I watched 2 days ago, Caitlin Collins asked the president, why was he so sure that this mineral deal would be some sort of a security guarantee for Ukraine. And the president answered her, he said, because the Russians would never attack if we had Americans in there, American companies doing the mining, trying to extract these resources. And then she pressed him. She said, but what if they do? And then, of course, he barked at her and said that she needed to worry about CNN failing as an organization versus asking him these kind of questions. So, I mean, you have to draw your own conclusions from that kind of a response. But to me, the fact that you have an American company doing mining there or something like that is hardly going to be a guarantee that Russia won't do other things against Ukraine. And of course, this is not happening in a vacuum. And I think this is why Ukrainian leadership is very reluctant to walk away to do something that would leave them so vulnerable. Um, but I don't know everything that's being talked about. I don't know all the discussions that are underway. I am concerned that the administration is undermining President Zelensky, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, and they're working with his opposition, like Ms. Tymoshenko, for example. Um, I mean, we're talking about undermining the leadership of a democratically elected government. It seems entirely inappropriate.
Yeah, it also seems strange to ask an elected leader to resign and to be replaced by someone else. If that had happened in the American administration, we would talk about interference into the democratic system of the US.
Yeah.
And the other way around, it seems to be quite acceptable. You talked about the 800 billion, which Commission President von der Leyen has announced today the Europeans will dedicate to defense in the future. That sounds very good, but that is a long-term process. Can we really expect that within a few months that has led to a stronger European military? Will that not take years to build up the production facilities and so on and so on?
Well, of course, this is not something that's going to be fixed before Christmas. But I think that there are things that can be done that provide immediate aid to Ukraine, as well as begin to change the readiness levels of European armed forces. So there is a near-term, mid-term, and long-term aspect to this. There's so much focus on producing new equipment, but actually the priority would be, number one, what do you have that you can get to Ukraine right now, especially since the United States has stopped shipment of ammunition and other aid to Ukraine? What can Europe do immediately? And you probably know that about 50% of the ammunition that is already being produced in Europe actually goes to customers in Uganda, UAE, and other countries in Africa and the Middle East, outside of Africa. This is where governments could tell companies like Rheinmetall, for example, we will protect you, but your ammunition, the agreement you have with UAE, that ammunition now has to go to Ukraine instead of UAE, and we'll work it out with the government, with the Emirates. For example, exactly as the U.S. did 2 years ago with the Swiss on the delivery of Patriots, where the Swiss were willing to let Ukraine move to the front of the line and take delivery of Patriots that were originally contracted to go to Switzerland. So this is where political will comes in, reprioritizing ammunition that already exists, which also tells you that there is a lot more capacity for ammunition production in Europe than maybe what we think. Another place where political will could make a difference is from the governments, like in Germany, where companies cannot make any military equipment or product without a direct order from the government. I would say take the shackles off, allow companies to innovate, to start expanding capacity in anticipation of getting an order. I've spoken to two different German CEOs of defense industry companies, and both of them said they were sitting on excess capacity. They could start the next day if the government would tell them to. So this is an area where I think you can get a very quick improvement. The second area where you can get very quick improvements is when the leadership starts making readiness the priority. The ready to fight tonight, to improve the readiness culture. So training, getting people in there and having an attitude the way, frankly, that the U.S. Army does, of being ready to fight tonight. That would do a lot to help improve the readiness of European countries. Now, frankly, most Eastern Europeans, they're not confused about who the bad guy is. They know Russia is. And so Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, they are prepared. But of course, I'm talking about Germany and Italy and others that need to regain that sort of fight tonight mentality.
You live in Frankfurt, so you can judge by yourself. What do you think? Has the opinion, the view of the German people changed regarding rearmament and being militarily much more prepared than in the recent few years?
I do. I think in the aftermath of the election of 23 February, my sense is probably at least 60% of the population is prepared to spend more on defense, to do more, to continue to support Ukraine. That's not 2/3, but it's more than half. All of my friends that live there in Frankfurt, where I am, they tell me all the time they're embarrassed that they have to do more. The Bundeswehr needs to be back at the level of readiness that it used to be during the Cold War days. They all understand and recognize this. And I think most people, just like in the US, if our civilian leaders speak to us as if we were adults and explain the risks, explain what's at stake, explain the costs and why we have to do this, frankly, I think most people would acknowledge that. I remember after the decision was made by Germany to stop Nord Stream 2, and there were a lot of people who were very anxious about what was going to happen in Germany when all of a sudden that Russian gas was no longer available. The government and people got busy preparing for it. And Germany got through the first and second winter after that very well. And the attitude changed. And so that's why I'm confident it can happen in Germany as well.
Mhm. The crisis with Ukraine between the US and Ukraine has also led to a deep transatlantic crisis. So if you speak again in a year's time, let's say, do you think NATO is still in existence and the US is still part of NATO?
Well, first of all, I will be very grateful if you give me another opportunity in a year to speak on your excellent program.
You can come sooner if you like.
Yes, I do believe NATO is still going to exist, but it's a shame that you even have to ask that question. NATO has never been perfect, but it is the most successful alliance and longest living alliance in the history of the world. 75 years. We're now in year 76. It grew from 12 countries to 32 countries. If NATO was not a successful alliance, you would not have all the former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact countries scrambling to join NATO as soon as they could. They know what it means to be in or under the Russian thumb. So the alliance has done its job quite well. It's not perfect. Yes, every nation should be doing more, and they don't. But that doesn't mean that the alliance itself is not an effective alliance. The other day, I think it was Thursday, when Prime Minister Starmer was in the Oval Office with President Trump, and President Trump was asked by a journalist, do you still believe in Article 5? The article of the Washington Treaty that says an armed attack on one shall be considered an armed attack on all. This is the easiest yes answer that any president could ever get. And the president should have said, yes, of course, I still believe in Article 5. We're a charter member of NATO. It's in our interest that Article 5 still stands, that NATO is successful, but all these other countries have got to do more. He could have done that right there. Instead, he waffled for just a minute. He hesitated and he kind of did not give a strong, clear answer. And that's what cast doubt inside the alliance. And it also tells the Russians that maybe there's a crack there, which I think then increases the risk of Russia making another terrible decision.
So if there were a little green man, Putin's green man, coming into Poland or Estonia or the Baltic states, do you think Trump would do something?
I do. I really do. But it would, it's hard to forecast exactly what he would say, but and how he would do things. Honestly, I'm embarrassed to say, but I do believe that most Republican members of the Congress are longtime transatlanticists, pro-NATO, even pro-Ukraine. And so I think that enough of them recognize how important our alliance is. The fact that we have every morning we wake up, we've got 31 friends, even if several of them are very annoying or troublesome. The fact is you've got 31 allies from the very beginning. And the bases that we have in Europe, airfields, air bases, and naval bases in UK, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Germany, Poland. This is for us. They're not there guarding Germans or French or Poles. These are platforms for us to project power into not only Europe, but also Africa and the Middle East. This is our advantage. There are hundreds of thousands of Americans besides me that live in Europe, with zillions of dollars worth of business in Europe. It's in our advantage, to our advantage, that Europe is stable and secure so that it can be prosperous. So I think at the end of the day, the president will make sure that we live up to our Article 5 obligations, or maybe that's just Ben Hodges, the eternal optimist, wants to believe that. I was worried that the other night when the president spoke to the joint session of Congress, that he might make some sort of a terrible announcement about NATO. Fortunately, he didn't. So we live to fight another day.
Even during his first term, he was very skeptical about Europe, including particularly Germany and then Chancellor Merkel, who he seems to have really disliked. How do you explain that? Is it really about the lack of the defense effort of the Europeans and perhaps the trade deficit of the Europeans with the United States with Europe? Or what is behind it? Why does he seem to have a particular dislike for the European continent?
Of course, I don't know this, but what I do believe, I spoke to back last spring, I spoke to a senior Republican congressman who I've known for many years, from way back when I used to work in Army Congressional Liaison. And this guy is a real stand-up guy. He's a pro-transatlantic. If I said his name, you'd know who it is. And I said, why does the president, or this day was last spring, so he was a candidate, but former President Trump, I said, why does he always talk about America got a bad deal? I mean, where does that come from? I mean, the international rules-based order that was established after World War II, thanks in large part to the United States as well as to UK and some other allies, we have benefited from this more than anybody. The world uses our currency. I mean, the whole game is set up to our advantage. Why does he think we got a bad deal? And what this member of Congress explained to me, he wasn't defending it, but he was explaining it because of course, he knows the president very well. He said, Ben, the president really believes that the United States has not been paid back by European countries for all the good stuff that we did. The nuclear shield, the defense, Marshall Plan, all the stuff, all the things that we do, we never got paid back for it. So a very transactional sort of thing. And then, of course, you can look and you see Germany, Netherlands, Norway, in particular, but some other countries, extremely wealthy countries. And yet they can't even meet a minimum of 2% of defense spending. And so I think this feeds his belief that we got a bad deal. Now that's a real estate developer attitude talking. We got a bad deal, and so we're going to make them pay. And at first I was a little skeptical, but the more when you watch his reaction, when you think about Panama Canal, we built that thing, and his facts may be off a little bit, but the fact that he said we built that thing, why are we having to pay for it? I mean, I think that's the mentality.
Yeah. Let me ask you a couple of more questions, but in the meantime, I would like to encourage our viewers to submit their questions in writing, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. There's a lot of speculation, General Hodges, in the media and among a lot of people that Trump really has a clever strategy, that he wants to enter into a new treaty relationship and an alliance with Putin in order to confront China together with Putin and perhaps the Europeans as well. So obviously he doesn't seem to regard the Europeans as all that important. That is also a Kissinger in reverse theory. Do you believe in that? Is there something in that?
I believe that there are people that believe that, and I believe that and I've seen where some people have speculated that somehow this is really a genius. You know, if we can separate Russia from China, we get Russia on our side. That's how we deal with China. I have a hard time believing that that's a viable strategy because I mean, there's nothing about Russia that indicates that they would ever be a very good ally, or that we could count on them to live up to agreements. But if we don't care about international law, if we don't care about respect for sovereignty, if we don't care about our European allies and what happens to them, then maybe it becomes more feasible. If you have an 18th century view of the world where this is ours, this is theirs, and this is the Chinese. Everybody get the three big powers get their sort of sphere, which was not unusual in the 18th century, but I don't think that most Americans actually want to go back to that, to live in that kind of environment. Certainly the Europeans who suffered under communism, who suffered under the Russian Empire, and who suffered under other authoritarian regimes want to lose what they have. And so it just doesn't seem like a plausible, feasible strategy. And we don't need Russia to stop China. What we need is the economic power that Russia does not have, but which Europe does have, working with our European allies to help Ukraine defeat Russia so we can deter China, so that the Chinese can see that we have the political will as well as the industrial capacity and military capability to do what needs to be done. That's how I think we stop China.
I also wonder how much strategic thinking is actually being done in the White House, or is it all impulsive and emotional and happening on the spur of the president's moment, so to speak? How would
Well,
you?
it would not be the first time that you had a president that, had strategic aims, but also made decisions that were spur of the moment or impulsive. I mean, you must have to admit that what Chancellor Merkel did when she decided that Germany would leave nuclear power after the tsunami and earthquake that wrecked Japan's nuclear power, that came across to me as an impulsive decision, not the result of years of strategic thinking that how do we get off of nuclear power. So, it's not unusual that a leader might make decisions in that way. What you hope is that the people around him or her will moderate those impulsive things and help craft a more strategic way of thinking.
Let's hope for the best. When you look at the whole situation, the whole, let's say, the mess which has been created in certainly the last week or two, and you put yourself into the shoes of Xi Jinping in Beijing, how would you see the situation? At the moment, it seems the Chinese are just sitting back and watching it all carefully without doing much. But do you expect that lessons will be drawn regarding Taiwan or also the South China Sea and things like that?
Well, that is the danger of our failure to help Ukraine defeat Russia, is that the Chinese will decide that we don't have the political will to actually do it, and that we also are willing to toss allies and partners aside, which might mean then that the Chinese may consider that we would do the same thing to Japan or South Korea or Australia, for example. They also can see that we're not willing to enforce respect for sovereignty. If we're going to tell the Ukrainians, hey, bad luck, you're going to have to let Russia keep Crimea and the Donbass. Then that tells Beijing that we're not serious about respect for international law, sovereignty, or even freedom of navigation. So then I think that raises the risk in the South China Sea, as well as Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on. And of course, it will be much, much more difficult to enforce those things out in the Indo-Pacific region than it is in Europe.
Trump always says that he wants to end wars, that he is a peacemaker. If there was something like happening regarding Taiwan and there was, Chinese aggression of some sort or the other, would Trump do something about it, or would he believe that not getting involved in wars is more important?
While I may be a harsh critic of the president, I do believe he is sincere when he says he wants to stop wars. He has actually a long record of talking about no more endless wars. So I believe he's sincere when he talks about that. Where I'll disagree, of course, is what price he's willing to pay and who pays that price to get to an end to the conflict. And certainly there's nothing about Russia that would make me think that they are a reliable negotiating partner or that they would live up to any agreement that they weren't forced to, with which they were not forced to comply. I don't know how he would react if the Chinese did decide to put in a blockade around Taiwan, for example, or to do something even more aggressive against the Philippines. And I don't know. If you believe in the theory that China can have this area, Russia can have this, and we want this, which is why he talks about Canada as a 51st state and Greenland and Panama, that would be our sphere, then he might not care as much. But he also, at the same time, has, when you talk about bad deals, I mean, China has been on the other side of a lot of bad deals for the United States in terms of stolen technology, tariffs, trade. So I don't know. I can't answer that question with any confidence.
But do you think that the administration is preparing itself to focus much more on China than on Russia? That Russia is indeed seen as a minor problem, mostly a problem for the Europeans rather than for the United States, and that the focus will go back to China again?
I absolutely believe that. Even though what we have in Europe is relatively small, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines is about 60,000 permanent and about 40,000 rotational forces. That's from all the services total. So that's not a huge number. It's not a lot of capability, but I think we're going to see in the next 3, 4, 5 months, we're going to start hearing about massive cuts to what is on the ground in Europe as the last Ukraine supplemental has just expired. That supplemental, in addition to providing aid to Ukraine, was also used to pay for 2 of the rotational brigades that are over in Europe. It's not sustainable to continue to pay for those brigades out of the base budget. So I think those will be the first 2 sent home soon. And then you've got something called EDI, the European Defense Initiative, which was a special fund created, I think, back in 2015 or 16 by the Congress to pay for rotational forces. That's how we get tanks back in Europe, because all the tanks went home, you may recall, several years ago. So armored forces, attack aviation, that's all paid. Those are rotational forces paid for by EDI, as are most of the National Guard and Reserve units that come over, which matters because that's where most of our engineering and logistics capability resides, is in our reserve component. That's paid for with EDI money. So that would be the second phase, is that the EDI money is turned off, assuming the Congress goes along with it. And then the third phase would be when they go after the very slim assigned forces that are on the ground in Europe. And it's not capability that's needed in the Pacific as much as I think they want to go after the funding that pays for that. So that can be used in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, all of these things, of course, are within the purview of any administration. Every administration always does something that we call a global force posture review, where you match priorities with resources and risks and try to get it aligned with what the priorities are for the administration. Clearly, Europe is U.S. forces in Europe are going to be a major bill payer, I think, and I think it's going to happen much sooner rather than later.
How many troops have we in American troops have we in Europe right now?
Total about 100,000. That's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. 60% are assigned, they live there. 40% are rotational, which means they come over from Fort Cavazos, Texas, or Fort Stewart, Georgia, Fort Carson, Colorado, etc. And so the numbers of people is 100,000 is a lot compared to most European militaries, but it's not a lot total. That's how many people sit in Michigan Stadium, okay? I mean, or Wembley Stadium in London. That's what we're talking about. But it's the money to pay for the rotations, moving equipment back and forth, exercises, et cetera. That's a lot of money. And so I think the administration would rather use that money in the Indo-Pacific region.
You said that you think Trump will stand by NATO. Will he also stand by the nuclear umbrella, which is the US is providing for Europe for many decades now?
I would feel much better if the president would come out and say, absolutely, it's in our interest. We're not doing this out of charity to Germany or Poland or Finland or other non-nuclear countries. It's in our interest that Europe is stable and secure and not under attack from Russia or anybody else because of our own economic interests. The economic relationship between the United States and Europe as a bloc is the biggest in the world. So it's important for our prosperity that Europe is prosperous, and Europe can only be prosperous if there's stability and security in Europe. So I think that the president probably could be persuaded and maybe already believes that that's important. I sure would like to hear him actually come out and say that. But now you've got the French are starting to say, maybe we can figure out a way to extend our nuclear deterrent to help Germany, for example, although Germany would have to pay a lot probably because nuclear forces are extremely expensive. Almost a half of the UK's budget is tied up in their very small nuclear force. So to extend France's capability, that would cost a lot of money. But you also hear about countries like Poland, Sweden, others that are beginning to think maybe they have to get their own. That's not good. You're talking about proliferation of nuclear weapons now, which is not in the strategic interest of the United States. So that's another reason for the president to say, hey, everybody settle down. Of course, you can count on the United States as a nuclear deterrent.
Thank you. Let's get some questions from our audience. Katie, would you like to ask the first question?
Absolutely. And this is very timely in the discussion about nuclear deterrence. We have a few audience members basically expressing concern over the fate of the nuclear umbrella. So Andrew and Stuart together, I've combined their questions, ask that as the US continues to renege on its defensive commitments, what is the likelihood that not only European countries, but then also Asian countries like Taiwan and Japan also pull back their nuclear statuses and start to develop their own nuclear arsenals?
Well, I think every sovereign nation, of course, has to defend itself. And you don't want to be held hostage to Russia or anybody else that has a nuclear weapon or wants to have a nuclear weapon. And I think the world saw that the United States, we were even held hostage by Russia constantly threatening that they would use a nuclear weapon if we helped Ukraine too much. And I think that caused the Biden administration to stop short of doing what we needed to do. So people can see that having nuclear weapons can obviously influence even superpowers. So I imagine that if the United States does not make it absolutely clear to all of our allies that you can count on the United States to protect you from any sort of nuclear attack, then they will understandably start looking for other solutions.
Thank you. Emma, would you like to ask the next question, please?
Yes, certainly. So circling back to an earlier conversation on intelligence sharing, Stuart Kaplan asks, is the fact that the US terminated intelligence sharing with Ukraine a forewarning that the so-called Five Eyes intelligence sharing of the US, UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand is at risk?
Excellent question. You know, just the other day, Mr. Navarro, who is a special counselor to the president, said maybe a way to put pressure on Canada is to kick them out of Five Eye. Now, that was one of the more ignorant statements I've heard coming out of a senior administration official. Canada, of course, still is part of the British Commonwealth. So the King of England has an interest, would be concerned, as would the Prime Minister of UK, that Canada might be, that the US might try to kick Canada out or exclude it from Five Eyes. The Brits would not stand for that. And so that shows an arrogant American-centric view of things. And also it reveals that Mr. Navarro and many others have no idea how we get intelligence, how we share intelligence, how much we depend on our allies inside the Five Eye network. But also, we get so much intelligence from the German BND, which is the German Intelligence Service. The best human intelligence we get comes from Estonia and other Baltic countries. So intelligence, most of the good intelligence doesn't come from an American satellite. It comes from a fusion of all kinds of sources of human intelligence, signals intelligence, good old-fashioned spy work, and analysts, people figuring out what's out there and what's going on. And I have to say, many Europeans are very concerned about who the president has installed as the director of national intelligence. Now, they won't say, hey, sorry, we're no longer going to send you stuff because Director Gabbard is somebody we don't trust. They just won't send it. And I think this is going to cause damage to our own intelligence, which is obviously bad for our security.
Thank you. How worried are you that the United States does not seem to gather offensive intelligence again against Russia? That seems to have been cut off as well. Is that important, or is that just a minor thing?
So this has been very confusing for me because I saw the statement that Secretary Hegseth said that we were going to stop any offensive cyber against Russia, cyber operations. And then, of course, there was huge outrage, like, what are you talking about? Why would we stop doing that against the country that has been the most active in using cyber against us and our allies? And then I think 1 or 2 days later, Secretary Hegseth came out and said, hey, I never said that. I never said that. But I think that either he was incompetent or he did say it and tried to walk it back, or we just don't know. But it's that kind of announcement that, you know, adds fuel to the belief that the administration really is siding with the Russians. Why else would you cut off intelligence to Ukraine and talk about or shut down cyber against Russia? And also, by the way, open up diplomatic relations with Russia like it's the good old days and let them bring back in hundreds of people to fill out all of their diplomatic sites, and they can resume doing what they have always done, which is espionage.
Are you expecting a summit between Putin and Trump anytime soon?
Well, I imagine both of them would love that. For me, the absolute nightmare would be for the president to go to Moscow on May the 9th for the big Russian Victory Day, and to have an American president sitting there on Red Square as you watch the army of murderers and rapists go marching by, parading with captured Ukrainian equipment, which was provided by the United States, UK, Germany, and others. That I hope that the president will not accept that kind of an invitation. I do imagine, though, that they are anxious to have a real summit where they can announce some big deal has been made.
Well, there could be a summit somewhere in Saudi Arabia, for example, or somewhere else.
That could be. But, you know, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It will not be obligated to accept whatever the US and Russia might come up with. Just like Germany, Poland, France, UK, Norway, Finland, these are sovereign countries. And if they're not a party to the negotiation and the agreement, they have zero obligation to adhere to whatever President Trump and President Putin might agree.
Does the whole scenario remind you a little bit of the Yalta Agreement some 80 years ago?
I think that is the dream of some people, to have that famous picture of Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin have that recreated with Trump, Xi, and Putin, the three guys, controlling everything. I don't know that for a fact, but certainly I think I see enough references to that by different people that I think that is an ambition for some. I think that would, it's hard to see how that would be good for America.
Thank you. Katie, do we have another question?
We do. Law Furgaz asks whether the Trump administration is walking into a diplomatic trap set by Putin, and asks whether Moscow is attempting to undermine trust in the U.S. by showing that the U.S. is willing to abandon its key allies.
I think that's absolutely part of the plan. And even if that's not what they're planning to do, that's the effect that people begin to doubt. And when Friedrich Merz the other day, who probably of all living senior German politicians said that we will have to do this without the United States to build up defense. I mean, that's an earthquake when a guy like that acknowledges that they can't depend on the United States. Again, I don't see how this is good for us.
Thank you. And perhaps a final question, Emma, would you have a good question?
Yes, Cody Love asks, do you believe the abdication, even if only temporary, of U.S. soft power programs through USAID and other agencies will have long-term impacts on U.S. security or strategic capabilities?
Generational. When you talk about no longer being able to help provide not only capability but hope to people, to generations of people in Africa, the Middle East, other countries like that, I don't know how that's good for us. But there's other kinds of soft power as well. The decision to withdraw from all these different international organizations, the World Health Organization, for example, or to constantly criticize the International Criminal Court. These are places where, yes, of course, it's frustrating, and yes, it's nonsensical that Iran could ever have a leadership position in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. But it's much easier to reform and cause change and make things happen inside these organizations than just walking away from them. And so soft power also includes working with other countries to hold Russia accountable for all of their many violations at sea, where they are using non-seaworthy ships, smuggling oil and gas that they sell to China and India. That's the only way they're able to pay for what they're doing. There are things that we could, if we do the hard work, we could be working with other countries in these organizations to hold them accountable. So again, yes, of course, it's frustrating that these things don't do what we always want them to do, but they are international organizations, and we would be much more effective, in my view, if we made them more effective and we emphasize them versus constantly throwing stones and then just walking away from them.
Thank you very much. Let me come back to our starting question. Is peace imminent in Ukraine? And you said maybe not imminent, but it may be just around the corner in a few months' time or so. Is that your belief that we will see peace in Ukraine in 2025, and that will be a peace which is acceptable to Ukraine and to the Europeans and to the United States, of course, and to Russia?
Well, first of all, I did not say just around the corner. That implies it's very quick. I would not say it's like that. I think we're in a process that is going to be months in the making before we get to a resolution that is acceptable to the Ukrainians and sustainable. That's, if it's not acceptable to them, I mean, they're the ones that are going to pay the price for any bad deal, as will Europe. So I think we're many months away from that. I'm reluctant to put a, by as of date. But on the other hand, this war could end tonight or tomorrow if Vladimir Putin said, hey guys, you know what? I was wrong. We're the ones that started this. We got a lot of problems at home in Russia. I'm pulling out. So he could stop. So if our president was actually seriously focused on peace, he could tell Vladimir Putin, say, hey, look, man, you're already ruining your country. Remember, the president even said that several weeks ago. He said, you are ruining your own country. So he knows that Russia is in big trouble. And he could tell President Putin, say, look, I haven't even begun to use the economic tools that we have. I can do a lot of things, the American president, that would dramatically reduce the price of gas, oil and gas around the world, and it would wreck Russia's economy. Or he can tell Vladimir Putin, say, look, I'm tired of messing with you. I'm going to give Vladimir Zelensky every weapon he wants without restriction, and we're committed to helping them win. So you can either make peace now, or I'm going to open up the gates on aid. So the idea that somehow it's Ukraine's fault that Russia invaded and that Ukraine is the only one that doesn't want peace, of course, is absolute total BS. But the American president has it in his hand to help bring this to a successful conclusion that's good for Europe, and especially is good for America's strategic interests.
So your suggestion is, instead of putting pressure on the weaker part, which is Ukraine, he should put pressure on Putin, the aggressor, of course, and end the war that way.
Absolutely. And that is what is in the best interest of the United States and all of our most important allies.
And if we come to some sort of compromise ceasefire, it will require an American security guarantee for Ukraine, or can we do without that?
Well, I think there's no point in claiming a ceasefire if you don't have a force that can compel the Russians to live up to it. I mean, as President Zelensky said in the Oval Office the other day, he said, hey, I've signed ceasefires with the Russians before. We know how that turned out in Minsk. And of course, every Ukrainian is aware of the Budapest Memorandum, where the US and UK plus Russia failed to live up to our obligations after Ukraine handed over their nuclear weapons. So they understandably have no confidence in us if we're not actually there to do something. Now, whatever ceasefire is agreed, it would also have to include a force. But if I was the commander of the force, my first question would be not how many troops do I get, but what is my mission? What do you want me to accomplish? Am I going to be in a zone of separation like we did in Bosnia to keep the two sides apart? Or am I sitting back over here with a reaction force? And it's also, what are my rules of engagement? Do I have to call Brussels or Washington to get permission to shoot down a Russian drone that's already dropped or has already hit a Ukrainian building? Or will I have the permission to shoot down that drone as soon as it enters airspace where it's not supposed to be? So these are the hard questions, and this is why it will take months to get a force ready. Plus, by the way, they have to be trained. They have to be land, sea, air, drone, counter drone, air and missile defense, all the enablers, and they have to be prepared to operate in a heavily contested electronic warfare environment where jamming will affect navigation, communication, targeting. This is going to take months of training for them to be ready to do that.
Maybe a quick final word, and then we'll bring it to an end, because I know you have to go. Do you feel that the global order, as we have known it for the last few decades, is being radically overturned, or do you believe optimistically that that order can survive and can be saved?
Yes and yes. It is in grave danger right now, real danger, but it's not irreparably broken. I think that, but things are changing, and the United States, as a result of all of this, is losing influence because Europeans are going to realize they're being forced to rely on themselves more economically as well as militarily, and we are going to lose influence if we are not careful.
Thank you very much. These were not very optimistic words, but realistic words, I would say. General Ben Hodges, has been a pleasure, as in the past. You really, once again, enlightened us and made a very complex and complicated situation a little clearer to all of us. So thank you very much for finding the time to do that. And hopefully we can welcome you again before 1 year is up and hear your wise words and interesting comments again. Thank you very much for joining us at the Krasno Global Event Series tonight. And I would like to thank all our many viewers to staying with us to the bitter end. And we will have more interesting events to you in the near future, which I will announce. And one final word, our talk today, our conversation today will be again on our famous YouTube channel. Within a day or two, it should have been uploaded. And so you're more than welcome to watch it again. And of course, all our many other interesting events. General Ben Hodges, it has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the privilege.
Bye.